morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. We're waiting for everyone to be let in through the waiting room.
I wanted just introductory type works from me, right? And I'll stay on for a while, but if we have 1,000 people, you're going to have a lot of questions, I would suspect. So.
Correct, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we have we expect quite a few participants. Over 1,000 have registered, so we look forward to being able to answer as many questions as we can.
Like a Zoom call.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll just ask everybody to mute themselves if you haven't already.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting very shortly. If you aren't already muted, we would just ask you to do so. Okay, good morning, welcome. We are nearly 1,000, oh, actually more than 1,000 people strong this morning, which is incredible. I'm Stephanie Cox, the Executive Director of the Regional Housing Network of Massachusetts, or RHN. We're gonna do our best this morning to avoid too many acronyms. We're very excited to be co-hosting this event with CHAPA. And if you don't already know, CHAPA is a statewide affordable housing policy organization that brings together people to advocate for the resources that we need to make sure everyone has a safe, healthy, and affordable home. And RHN represents the regional administering agencies, or RAAs, that's another term you might hear throughout this, webinar, that run the Raft program itself, as well as Section 8, MRBP, and a variety of other programs. And most of the RAAs have what's called a Housing Consumer Education Center, or HCEC, where many of the housing counselors are certified by HUD. And we're basically the housing hubs of Massachusetts for the public. We administer the state's official rental and mortgage assistance program, Raft, among many, many other housing counseling services, such as being the go-to agencies for navigating the eviction and foreclosure moratorium passed just a few weeks ago. Just a little bit about Raft and why we're having this webinar this morning. A few weeks ago, Mass Housing Partnership and CHAPA did a great webinar that was all about creating a rental assistance program. And we saw a lot of questions emerge about Raft, the Residential Assistance for Families in Transition program. It's been operating for years through the RAAs of RHN. And when this crisis hit, the governor acted quickly to divert more money into it. If everybody could just mute their devices, that'd be awesome. Thank you. So since Raft is the state's official emergency rental and mortgage assistance program for households under 50% of area median income, and since the RAAs have so much experience implementing it, it's easy to scale up in an emergency. Of course, there's just so much need going on right now that we need as many resources for folks as we can get. And it's terrific to see so many people stepping up, responding to this crisis, and being really great neighbors. So whether you are a case manager with a nonprofit looking for resources for your client, a town official looking to create a rental assistance resource for your constituents, or a legislator or aide, as I used to be, fielding calls from constituents, we want everyone to know how Raft is working during this time of COVID, and how other funds can work in collaboration with it so that we have the best outcomes and also the least confusion for folks in need during this scary time. So just a couple of quick meeting logistics. Again, please mute yourself during the call so that we can hear all of the speakers clearly. If you have questions for the panelists, please type them into the chat and then direct them to the participant named questions. That's Eric Shupin from CHAPA. He's going to work to compile all those questions, and we'll be asking them during the Q&A. And we're going to get to as many questions as possible, but we'll also follow up with anything not covered in the webinar. So there will be follow-up from us. And just so you know, this session is being recorded, so it can be shared afterward with folks who couldn't make it. Now I want to introduce Raphael Maris, the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Developers, who has graciously agreed to be our facilitator for the morning. Raphael, please take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to have the opportunity to moderate this fantastic webinar today. Thank you, everyone, for putting it together. COVID-19 presents an unprecedented emergency that threatens the housing stability of residents across Massachusetts. I assume that's why all of you have joined this webinar today to look for solutions. In Chelsea and Revere, where the neighborhood developers of the community development organization that I lead is based, prior to the pandemic, we already had a housing crisis that increased rents and home prices to levels unaffordable to members of our communities. We've also been hit hard by both the public health and economic impacts of COVID-19 in Chelsea and Revere. Our team at the Neighborhood Developers is deeply involved in the pandemic response, providing food, emergency cash, assisting people with their unemployment and SNAP applications. We now also have converted our VITA tax preparation program to a virtual program so people can apply remotely, complete their taxes remotely and get their earned income tax credits or their tax refund. And we help members of our community apply for Raft. We have supplemented these public benefits by distributing generous private donations through the One Chelsea Fund and a GoFundMe campaign of the Revere Teachers Association, for example, but we still can't come close to meeting the need in our communities. We know that housing stability is critical for positive health outcomes, for families and individuals, and for protecting public health. Enacting a statewide eviction and foreclosure moratorium was a critical step to immediately prevent residents from losing their homes during this crisis. However, the moratorium does not cancel missed rent or mortgage payments. As a result, the rent owed just piles up and the threat of eviction comes back just a little later. Residents, especially those with the lowest incomes, need assistance in making these housing payments. Raft and its existing delivery system will be an essential tool for helping people stay stable in their homes when the state of emergency ends. So let me go over just briefly about what our goals are for this webinar today. We want to increase our awareness and understanding about Raft, what resources it offers, how the program works, and how residents can access it. We want to learn how Raft is working in the time of COVID-19 and about the changes that DHCD has made to add flexibility to the program. We want to find out more about municipalities that are creating their own emergency rental assistance programs and how they can work with their regional housing agencies. Finally, we will discuss what actions we can take to help expand Raft to serve even more people in Massachusetts. We begin with remarks of three honored guests who have volunteered to help us understand how the state is responding to meet the housing needs of Massachusetts during this emergency. I'd like to now introduce our first speakers. We're honored to be joined by the chairs of the Joint Committee on Housing, Representative Kevin Honan and Senator Brandon Crighton. Both helped pass our statewide eviction and foreclosure moratorium, providing some of the strongest protections for renters and homeowners in the nation. Rep. Honan was an original sponsor of the legislation, and Senator Crighton helped pass the bill in the Senate. We thank both of you for your long-standing support for affordable housing in the legislature. Representative Honan will speak first, followed immediately by Senator Crighton.
Thank you very much, Raphael, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I have over the years worked very closely with CHAPA and the Regional Housing Network. So I want to thank Eric and Rachel and all of our good friends who have been involved for so many years. I also want to say a special hello to Stephanie Cox and congratulate her on her new position of Executive Director of the Regional Housing Network. It's also great to see Jennifer Maddox, the Undersecretary, here as well. And I look forward to working with you throughout the crisis that we're involved in here and trying to provide services to people who are in need all across the Commonwealth. The Raft program is an incredibly effective state-run program. It fills the gap for many families, allowing them to stay in their homes. We know how important safe and stable housing is, but especially important during this pandemic. As you heard earlier, we did pass the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, and we realize that perhaps is one of the strongest bills in the country protecting people at this time when we're asking people to socially separate and keep distance. It's even more important at that time to allow people to stay in their homes. But we realize that at the end of the state of emergency, there are going to be issues here and some real need to help people pay their rent and help them with mortgages. So this is a key element of state government to try to help people. In my neighborhood, I represent the Allston-Brighton section of Boston. So what we've seen here in the community of organizations like the West End House Boys and Girls Club, the YMCA, they've completely transformed their mission from youth education and recreation to providing meals to people. And there were long lines out in front of the West End House, such that I've never seen before. And the lines were so long, they said, we have to start delivering the meals because the people are getting too close to each other. And the main issue that my staff are dealing with remotely from their homes are unemployment insurance claims. We find so many people who are out of work right now who are in very, very difficult need. So the state has so many claims coming in, and in my particular district of Allston-Brighton, we've been helping hundreds of people. So the demand for housing services has never been greater. The Regional Housing Network has seen 200 to 400% increase in calls. Our great partner here in Boston is Metro Housing Boston, and they've seen 300% increase. So my Senate co-chair and I, Senator Crighton, who is from Lynn, we look forward to working with all the advocates, trying to get through this crisis and trying to help people who need housing. Obviously, with people losing their jobs at such a large rate, we really need to do a lot in this area. So I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you again for tuning in, and look forward to hearing what the other folks have to say. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Senator Crichton, are you on the call?
I am here. Thank you, Raphael. Thanks for your warm introduction, and certainly it's great to work with you.
Yeah, was I supposed to introduce?
Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, Senator, thank you.
Yes. Welcome, Senator.
Okay. Sorry, I got a lot of feedback. All right, so rough start. Now, thank you, Raphael. We got to work together on transportation many years ago, and it's great to join you on housing issues now, and to Rachel Heller, Eric Shupin, Abby Curb from CHAPA. Thank you so much. And to obviously Stephanie Cox of RHN and Steve Farrell from Metro Housing Boston. And to all of you, it's easy to get down in the dumps during these difficult times. But when you have 1,000 strong on a Zoom call to talk about Raft and housing, it certainly shows the passion and how much people really care and how big of an issue it is. So thank you all for joining. All of you have been integral in working with us and keeping us informed about all the changes needed for Rafts and other key housing pieces. And it's because of the relationships I feel like we have with the housing advocates, as well as with my great co-chair, Kevin Honan, who's been doing this for many years. that we were able to get a really comprehensive eviction and foreclosure moratorium passed, really one of the strongest in the nation. And I don't think that would have happened if we couldn't be comfortable calling you at late nights and on the weekends and asking the stupid questions from time to time. But it really was a team effort, and it wouldn't have been done without the advocacy of so many on this call today. So just real quickly, obviously Kevin and Raphael talked a little bit about, and Stephanie talked about how big of an impact this, was already having on our state, but in particular during this crisis. Recently, surveys from the Center of Housing Data in Massachusetts Housing Partnership in Boston indicators found roughly 22% of renters and nearly that of homeowners are unable to make any payment at all so far this month. Furthermore, low-income households are more likely to have made a partial or no payment. My office has spoken with shelter associations and housing advocates across the state to discuss this issue. And certainly, it's not an issue that's just in Greater Boston. This is across the entire state. We've heard countless stories from my district alone about parents and individuals struggling to juggle with the cost of rent. And again, this crisis, we don't know how long it's going to last. And it's imperative that we take action now and start to deal with what was already a housing crisis in the state, but is further exacerbated by this pandemic. I would like to say thank you to Governor Baker, to DHCD, and Mass Housing for quickly taking action for the $5 million toward the Raft program. But obviously, we know that funding is already running out. As Representative Honan mentioned, we are both strongly advocating for an increase to the Raft appropriation in the upcoming budget. Thank you again to CHAPA, RHN, for the opportunity to speak here today. We're committed to continuing this fight. I know we have so many folks on the call. I don't want to continue to ramble on, but I really thank you for all of your work, and more importantly, I hope that everybody is staying safe and healthy during these difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Crighton and Representative Honan. We really appreciate everything you do for affordable housing and your remarks and getting us kicked off today. We are also honored to be joined by Undersecretary Jennifer Maddox. The Undersecretary was appointed only in February, right before the pandemic. I'm not sure that's what you signed up for, but we really appreciate we have you. She has been with DHCD over 20 years and has been helping lead the Baker administration's housing COVID-19.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Chap. Good morning, and thank you, CHAPA, for continuing to be a leader for our community at this time. Thank you to Representative Honan and Senator Crighton for joining us today. Rachel and team, your calls continue to be a resource for stakeholders and an opportunity to share information, best practices, and highlight both immediate needs and get us thinking about long-term issues. And opportunities you're creating, like this webinar, to raise awareness about resources and provide a new forum for discussion and engagement. Today, we are talking about an important resource, the Residential Assistance for Families in Transition, or Raft program. In March, we announced an additional $5 million for mass housing for the program to help households affected by COVID-19 state of emergency. We are eager to make many more households aware of it as a resource, and to highlight how vital rental assistance will continue to be for families in need. Amy Mullen, who oversees the program, will answer questions about eligibility and get into further detail about the specific program. Ensuring housing stability in all of our communities across Massachusetts is at the core of what we do at DHCD. From the development of new affordable housing to housing search for families in our shelter system, we interact with the affordable housing ecosystem, nonprofit service providers, and other state agencies. And the importance of housing stability for families, neighborhoods, children, local businesses, and communities has never been more apparent than during this crisis. I was appointed by Governor Baker on February 21st, and my entire department went into work from home mode on March 18th. The beginning of this new job did not go quite as planned, but I am really pleased and grateful to have a staff that has stepped up to the challenge. When it comes to our reopening, our agency will continue to work from home until further notice. It is clear that for us, working from home will be continuing for the near future But as you can be assured, we will continue the work no matter where our staff sits. As many of you know, Secretary Mike Keneally is co-chairing the advisory board, and we will continue talking about the new normal. What will it look like for DHCD? I know there are a lot of questions about Raft, but I want to take this opportunity to highlight a few other important things we've been doing. So far, our top priority since the beginning of this crisis has been to stabilize our families and the vulnerable populations who DHCD services. We were proud to see Governor Baker file the eviction and foreclosure moratorium to give our household necessary breathing room during this crisis. We worked with the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development and heard from many stakeholders to support tenants. We rolled out an online form for tenants to fill out and send to landlords, as well as a packet of instructions and general guidance on the legislation for households. This form has now been translated into several languages and is all available online. We have been in overdrive across all the divisions at DHCD, and especially within two. Our Division of Housing Stabilization oversees the entire Family Emergency Assistance Shelter System, which houses over 3,200 families, provides significant funding and support to individual shelters across the state, and manages our Raft and home-based programs, which help stabilize households in crisis and provides funds for homeless families to find housing. Our Division of Public Housing oversees about 45,000 state-aided public housing units, made up of upwards of 200 separate local housing authorities. Much of our state-aided public housing is reserved for seniors. In many of our larger cities, our senior housing is made up of dense, high-rise developments, which have been of particular concern with the potential rapid spread we've seen at many senior care facilities. So far, knock on wood, we have not experienced significant spread throughout the portfolio. We have to remain vigilant, and I'm really thrilled that we are distributing about 3 million face masks to staff and residents beginning this week. As you can imagine, they have been very busy. Our housing development and rental assistance divisions have been working on a variety of emergency guidance for state, federal rental voucher administrators and private affordable operators. This is a real challenge right now for our operators of affordable housing, one that we can only assume will be maintained. Many operators are seeing significant reductions in rent. This pandemic has cost hundreds of thousands of jobs here in Massachusetts and millions across the nation. Everyone is seeing a drop in revenue and an increase in expenses, but we believe that with the combined resources of our state and the CARES funding we've already received from the federal government and other COVID-19 relief funding from Congress, we will have many types of resources available for the near-term future. We do have some good news with regards to federal CARES funding and other programs. Substantial parts of the Federal CARES Relief Act provide funding for programs that DHCD has long administered, including the Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG. So far, we have received about $120 million, $16 million in emergency solutions grant funding. We have also have an open NOFA online to support our families and individual shelters, $24 million for community services block grants that will go to the community action agencies, $27 million for LIHEAP that will help with the next heating season. We imagine many more households may be eligible next year, depending on the economic recovery. And $5 million for administration tenant-based rental assistance, Section 8, with more expected for housing assistance payments. We have received $46 million for communities through the Community Development Block Grant Program. The first phase of funding, $20 million, is for non-entitlement communities only. And we plan to focus about half of that funding for housing assistance and the other half for services and micro-enterprise assistance. Earlier this week, we posted the NOFA on Combis and encouraged everyone to take a look. Last week, we received the second phase of $26 million. This funding is for the entire state, and we will be working with stakeholders in and outside state government to determine how to best allocate those funds. We anticipate that rental assistance will continue to be a priority for CDBG funding. We do not expect the need to disappear overnight, just as the virus is not going to disappear suddenly. We continue to talk with ANF and our other partners to coordinate funding and expect further federal funds to come to DHCD. We expect a great deal of this funding will be used by communities to stabilize households, provide more services for those affected by COVID-19 and other emergency local needs. I also want to touch on the supplemental budget that was filed last week by the governor. I'm not sure if you've looked at it, but you might find it looked a little different than the supplemental budget we're used to seeing, since all $1 billion is in one line item, similar to the earlier funding package the legislature passed in March. Filing the supplemental amount through a single reserve provides the administration with the greatest flexibility to maximize all available funding sources and adjust funding to meet the needs of the public health emergency. We have some initial estimates of the funding that DHCD will receive, but it is subject to change. We are anticipating $16 million for housing and homelessness, with roughly $14 million for our local housing authorities and the remaining $2 million for family and individual shelters that are ineligible for federal CARES ESG funding mentioned earlier. We haven't taken our eyes off of our long-term goals of increasing access to affordable housing, but it's important to understand that while the virus may not be with us forever, the ramifications for our vulnerable communities will outlast the health crisis. It is hard to know exactly what all those ramifications will be or how the economic crisis will ripple across industries. We are talking with our quasi-public agencies, Mass Housing Partnership, and CDAC to think creatively about what we need and the resources we have. As we hope to move from triage mode to a more medium-term approach, we will continue to ask for your ideas, support, and partnership to tackle what we can only imagine will be a tough outlook. I want to thank you for participating today, and please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay strong.
Thank you, Undersecretary Maddox. Really appreciate the remarks and all the good work that you are doing and your team at DHCD.
You're welcome.
We are now ready for our first panel discussion to learn more about Raft, how it is administered, and how residents can access it. Our panelists are Amanda Watson, Housing Consumer Education Center Director at the Franklin County Regional Housing and Redevelopment Authority, and Amy Mullen, Raft and Home-Based Program Manager at DHCD. I will ask our panelists a few questions, and then we will take some questions from participants. Amanda, I'd like to start with you. Amanda, could you please tell us who is... Good morning, Amanda. Thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about who is eligible for Raft?
Yep. So Raft is, anyone is eligible for Raft. You no longer have to have dependent children in your household. Anyone in Massachusetts should apply for Raft if they're looking for assistance. You do need to be at or below 50% AMI to be eligible, but the criteria is no longer having dependent children in the household.
Does that income restriction apply to an applicant's current or their historical income?
So this would be your current income. So regardless of what you had a month ago, if you are calling now, we're basing it on your income as of today when you are applying.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about what expenses Raft covers?
Sure. Raft can cover several different expenses. We can cover rental, so back rent, so for rent arrearage, or for late mortgage payments if someone has fallen behind on their mortgage. We can also cover utility payments. So if you have a light bill or a gas bill that is that you're unable to pay for, we can do property taxes if you've fallen behind on your property taxes, or first, last, and security to help someone get into a unit. There's really many things that Raft can assist with to try and keep someone from becoming homeless.
Excellent. I'm gonna switch to Amy now and then come back to you. Amy, thank you for joining us on this panel.
Good morning, thank you.
Good morning, Amy. What are the different types of Raft assistance that exist? I was hoping you could walk us through that.
Yeah, so right now there are 3 types of Raft funding. First, there's traditional Raft, and that's the program that's been around for many years and that providers are probably most familiar with. Helps people who are at risk of becoming homeless. And like Amanda said, it helps people who are at risk due to a variety of different reasons, and it can help them with a variety of different expenses. Second, there's Upstream Raft, which is a pilot program that DHCD launched last July 2019 in an effort to assist households sooner than the court eviction process. So before the pandemic and the moratorium on evictions, traditional Raft could only help prevent an eviction once the household was actually involved in housing court. And last spring and summer, DHCD heard a lot of concerns from providers and advocates about the need to help households sooner before they had an eviction on their record. So although there is currently a moratorium on evictions, we are still using Upstream Raft for any household who's behind on rent or mortgage. Upstream Raft will pay for rent and mortgage arrears only, up to 4 months of a household's arrears. And I'll mention that traditional and Upstream Raft are both funded through the Raft appropriation, which in fiscal year 20 is $23 million. So of that, $16 million is for traditional Raft, and the remaining $7 million is allocated for Upstream Raft. But now we have the COVID-19 Raft Response Fund as well as a third pot of funding through Raft. And that's funded at $5 million through the funding from Mass Housing that Undersecretary Maddox referred to earlier. So the pandemic reached Massachusetts right around the time that many of the Raft agencies started to run out of their standard Raft funding. So this additional funding is allowing the regional agencies to continue to serve households. The funds are intended for any household who has been impacted either directly or indirectly by COVID-19.
Amy, in response to COVID-19, DHCD has significantly increased the flexibility for Raft applications, even beyond the distinction between the downstream and upstream Raft you just described. And that makes it an even more valuable tool to help address this crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about what those changes are that DHCD recently made?
So we've made some policy changes that apply to both the COVID-19 Raft funds and the standard Raft funds for those agencies that do still have traditional or standard Raft funds available. And we made these changes in an effort to get the funds out to households in need faster and in a way that's responsive to some of the unique housing challenges that households are facing right now during the pandemic. So first and foremost, we've made it a lot easier for households to apply for funding remotely. With the regional administering agencies currently closed to the public, each regional agency, like Franklin County and their partners, has adopted different approaches to serving households remotely, kind of depending on the needs of their region. So many are using online application forms or shortened application forms, which can be found on their website. And all regionals have the ability to process applications remotely, whether online, over the mail, through drop boxes, or even over the phone while their offices are closed. Another change is that we've introduced a flexible documentation policy. So we're giving regional administrators the flexibility to waive documentation that's normally required for Raft if the household can't provide it due to COVID-19. And then we've also made some policy changes around what kinds of situations are eligible for Raft. So the first is that we've waived the need for a court summons across the board. We know that because of the moratorium, evictions are not happening right now. So therefore, a household does not need to be in the eviction process to apply for any types of Raft funding right now. And similarly, for homeowner households, we've waived the need for a foreclosure notice. But we're also allowing households to apply sooner. So normally, if someone was at risk of eviction, we ask them to show that they were already behind at the time that they applied for Raft. Now a household is able to apply for help with future rent or future mortgage in a unit they're already living in if they can show that they've had a loss of income or some other emergency that's going to prevent them from paying future housing costs. We've waived the requirement for a shut-off notice for help with utilities. We've also waived the Raft screen score. So for those who are familiar with Raft, you know that normally when someone applies for Raft, they're asked a series of questions about their homelessness risk factors and given a score that estimates how likely they would be to become homeless without assistance. And this is just one way that DHCD has in the past tried to target the limited funding. But now for households accessing both traditional and COVID Raft, we're not using the Raft screen score as a way to target funds. And just finally, we're excluding CARES Act payments from applicants' gross income when we calculate their 50% area median income limit. So that means that for households who've gotten the $1,200 stimulus checks or who are getting the $600 weekly additional unemployment payments, those do not count toward their income calculation for Raft.
I think you've touched on this already, but I just want to make sure that we're clear because there's so much information we're learning about today. With an eviction moratorium in place that prohibits notices to quit, is a notice to quit required to access Raft?
Thank you for asking that, because no, there's no requirement for a notice to quit or for an eviction notice for someone to apply for Raft. So if the household is behind on rent, we will take any sort of document that can verify the amount owed, which could be as simple as a letter or a rent ledger from the landlord. A notice to quit is never required right now.
Thank you, Amy, for clarifying that. I'm going to turn back to Amanda. In the 8 weeks since the state of emergency declaration, Metro Housing Boston has received almost 2,200 pre-applications for Raft. That's more than the total number of households that they were able to help last year. They are currently averaging more than 40 pre-applications each day, nearly 300 per week. Working in Franklin County, how has COVID-19 increased the demand for housing resources like Raft?
Yeah, we have seen a rise in calls and inquiries about Raft as well. It is more than tripled, especially in homeowners. We're definitely seeing a lot more homeowners call compared now with COVID than we had seen last year at the same time, with so many folks just not knowing where their next check is going to come and if they can pay their mortgage. So the increase for us has definitely more than tripled, and across the state, it has increased over between 200% and 400% just statewide. So we're feeling it everywhere.
Amanda, can you walk us through the application process for Raft during the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, and Amy did touch on a lot of this already. I'll just kind of do another brief rundown. So if someone is looking for Raft assistance, they should call their local Raft administrating agency. They can find that at mass.gov if they're looking for Raft services and do a quick search. What they will do a basic intake, and the Raft administrating agency would give them a call back or do online and do a screen to determine that their eligibility, making sure that they are in fact under the 50% AMI. And once they are determined eligible for Raft, they would start the application process, which Amy did say, it is a shorter process and can be done much easier now for folks so that they don't have to come out of their homes as most offices are closed. So they would gather all of the documentation that is required. And if they can't get those documentation, as Amy said, those things have been waived. Their landlord would be required to do what is called an owner contract to show what is being asked for the back rent if it is rent. And those papers would be submitted to the Raft administering agency. And if they were approved, the checks would be sent out to the landlords or to the utility company to ensure that those utilities or that the housing is secured.
Great. And to be clear, let me just ask you a few follow-up questions so we're all on the same page. Is a written lease required to access Raft?
No, a written lease is not required to access Raft. We can work something out with speaking with the landlord and the tenant to determine that the tenant does in fact stay in that unit, but it is not required to have a written lease.
And how often can a household receive Raft?
So in general, it is one time within 12-month period, but it is up to $4,000. So if a family had come in October and say they used it for a utility bill and it was $500 and they're now falling behind on their rent, they can reapply for Raft and use the remainder balance of that $4,000 within the 12-month frame.
And I think you touched on this a little bit, but what should an owner or property manager expect when a resident receives Raft benefits?
Right. So we do have what's called an owner contract, which would be sent out to the property owner or their property management that they would need to fill out that showed us what had happened. So there was a tenant ledger showing that the tenant had fallen behind and some proof of ownership that they are in fact the owner. And once those paperwork has been processed, the checks are sent directly to the owner of the property.
Great. One big issue we're seeing in Chelsea, and I'm sure that's the case in other parts of the state, is that immigrants without documentation aren't eligible for all public benefits. And so there's some challenges around that. I was wondering if you can answer the question of eligibility for Raft for immigrants without documentation, and give us a little bit more detail about how that process works.
So there is no, there's no requirement. So a person who is undocumented can apply for Raft and is eligible for Raft. Raft would use, we don't need a social security number in order for them to apply for services. And as long as, again, they are under the income limits and are eligible, they would be able to move forward in the Raft process just like anyone else applying for Raft.
Excellent. Eric, I was wondering if you have received any questions for our panel from the audience in the chat box.
Excuse me. Yes, and thank you for everyone who's been sending questions. I'm doing my best to go through them. One of the questions, or several of the questions, had to do with timeline. Can you provide an estimate of how long you can expect someone for the process to take in order to get the benefits?
Yep. So in general, from start to finish, from the pre-application or the assessment, it can take about 2 to 3 weeks draft for all of the documentation to be gone through and approved, and then for a payment to go out. And but generally, it's about 2 to 3 weeks, and they send their checks out at specific dates depending on which location you're at. But it should not take more than the 3 weeks.
Amanda, sorry to ask you again. My name is Sylvia. I work with a lot of immigrants and undocumented population. And always when I'm asking about Raft is for Raft application, it's a confusion. Sometimes I'm hearing, yes, the undocumented can apply. In another occasion, they are telling me, no, they have to be a mixed family. They mean someone else has to have a social security number. I hear from you, Amanda, yes, it is possible, but sorry, I have to ask you again because there's a lot of confusion about it.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. So, and Amy, I don't know if you want to jump in on this as well, but according to Raft guidelines, undocumented folks are able to apply for Raft. And so that would be, should be fine for them to do this, and maybe something that you need to specifically speak with that Raft administering agency. Though there should not be a problem with them applying. Amy, did you want to add to that?
No, that's exactly right. There is not a rule that that one person, for example, in the household has to have legal status. A family of exclusively undocumented household members is still eligible for Raft, and they can apply.
Thank you. And I wanted to remind folks, if they have questions, to please type them into the chat box so that I can help go through the questions. But I appreciate all of that information and for your question too, Sylvia. Another question in regard to living situations, it was mentioned that around a lease being not required, but what about other living situations where there are roommates or subleases? Are those residents able to qualify for Raft?
Yes, so we'll do our best to work with kind of any situation that presents at one of the regional agencies. So for roommate situations, if there's an agreement about who pays what amount of rent, one roommate or could potentially apply on their own as their own household. With subleases, we're committed to finding a way to help those households. So if they have a written sublease, that's probably the easiest way to go about things. With Raft, we pay the property owner and we verify their ownership before we send the payment out from the Raft agency. But we have heard some concerns from the community that there are folks out there who are in sublease situations where maybe the landlord is not aware or it's not so cut and dried. So for those, I would say to bring those concerns to the Raft administering agency, and we will do our best to find a way to help the household.
Thank you. A question for landlords and property managers. Can landlords or managers submit applications for tenants, and do the landlords receive the funds, the landlords or owners receive the funds allocated directly to them?
Yes, funds are issued directly from the Raft administering agency, either by a check or direct deposit directly to the property owner. As far as the landlord applying for an applicant, the applicant should be the one to, sign the application and submit the paperwork and the documentation, but a landlord could certainly help connect someone to the regional agency and facilitate that process. Amanda, I don't know if you have anything more to say about that.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, we definitely in Franklin County often have had landlords make referrals for their tenants, but yeah, the tenant needs to be the person who is applying and supplying their own documentation.
Thank you. There were questions concerning the use of Raft funds and what they can cover. Can you just cover that? Again, there were questions specifically related to, can Raft cover utility payments or first and last month's rents or moving expenses? What other expenses could be covered?
Yep, so the utility payments, so like I had said, so if it's a gas bill or electric bill, we can also do, yes, the first, last, and security, or property taxes, or a water bill for a homeowner, or that mortgage payment. So if it's employment related, transportation, if it's related to their work and their housing situation, then that oftentimes can be done as well. But in general, it is mostly used for the rent arrearage, mortgage, or utilities to maintain that housing.
Thank you, Amanda. I had several questions about completing the applications and getting assistance or help to do so. There may be technology or language barriers that residents who need access to this resource may have. Are there any recommendations from administrators to help residents fill out the application?
Most applications have been put in several different languages. So if it's a language barrier and that the problem was just that they weren't able to have it in their specific language, most applications have been changed over to the proper language that someone may be looking for. And I know that most agencies do have resources to get a translator or someone to just help walk someone through filling out the application so that they're able to do it with assistance and that it's done properly, and so there is no lag time due to it may be cognitive or language barriers, so that we're able to help everyone process easily.
Thank you, Amanda. This one I think may be for Amy, but we've had some questions about sustainability still being a factor for receiving Raft payments. Do people who cannot show a future ability to pay rent, are they still able to receive Raft?
Yes, yeah, and so we understand that particularly right now with the future so uncertain, people may not be able to prove that they will be able to sustain their rent after Raft stops paying, because the limit is $4,000. And so the administering agencies right now are not looking at future sustainability when approving Raft applications. We're hoping to use the funding to get people through the crisis, and we hope that they'll be able to pay rent or mortgage or housing costs after the $4,000 runs out, but they don't have to prove that they'll be sustainable when the funding ends.
Thank you, Amy. We've received a couple questions about the maximum Raft benefits. Can you talk, either Amy or Amanda, about that maximum benefit? There's some questions about hearing about the Raft covering up to 4 months of rent or having it be $4,000, and whether this applies to receiving benefits from other programs such as home base.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So right now there is the Raft limit is $4,000. The 4 months of housing expenses refers only to the Upstream Raft program. And so it's 4 months with a $4,000 limit. As far as home base, there is right now a limit of $10,000 combined between the two programs over a 12-month period. So if someone, the home base limit is $10,000 and Raft is $4,000, but if someone happens to be receiving both of those within the same 12-month period, which I will say isn't too common, they would be limited to $10,000 during that year.
Thank you, Amy. A question also on just in terms of what documents or what notice might be required for a family or household to access Raft. But to clarify, if there is no notice to quit required, how does a household demonstrate that they need Raft assistance?
So a family could demonstrate, oh, go ahead, Amy.
No, go ahead, Amanda.
So this can be demonstrated by showing the loss of income so that we know that you're unable to pay your rent because you've now lost your income, or even with what is some of the required documentation from the landlord would be a tenant ledger that's showing each month paid or unpaid. So just that document itself would show us that the tenant had missed a payment, and then it would tie in with this, obviously with the same loss of income. So we'd be able to put those two together to show that there's the inability to pay and move forward with Raft.
Thank you. Questions about, oh, yes, Raphael.
I think we have time for one more question. And I just wanted to let people know that I've shut off my video briefly because my internet is unstable. That way I can continue to have audio.
Thank you, Raphael. So I'm going to ask one more question, and I know we've received so many more in the chat box, so thank you. Again, we will be following up after this webinar with an FAQ to hopefully respond to many more that we'll be able to share. But a question for those who may be in subsidized housing, such as in public housing or receiving rental assistance. To clarify, can they access Raft? And are there any restrictions on what they can access or how often?
So people in subsidized housing can access Raft. If they're using Raft for back rent, we first want to look at why the rent is owed and if it's something that can be adjusted or fixed by talking to either the housing authority or the subsidy administrator. And I know that a lot of them have issued guidance during COVID-19 that they will process more interim rent recertifications than usual. So the HCECs and the Raft agencies are looking to make sure that this rent is actually should be owed and should be applied to the tenant's balance. But if it is, owed to them, or if they do owe it, and it can't be changed retroactively, they can access Raft. There is a limit of 6 months of a subsidized rent arrears for Raft that was in place before the pandemic and remains in place. We did waive one rule that said that households could only access help with subsidized rent arrears once every 24 months. We've waived that for now during the pandemic. So if people owe back rent with a subsidy and we can't have the rent adjusted, they can access up to 6 months of help, not to exceed $4,000.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Amanda, for participating in this panel. I think you answered a lot of our questions. And as Eric pointed out, and by the way, thank you, Eric, for fielding all those questions from the chat box. There are more questions out there, but we will get answers for all of them in a subsequent communication. But I'd like to move us now to our second panel. We will have the opportunity to hear from Shelley Goering, the Senior Program Manager at Massachusetts Housing Partnership, and Stephanie Cox, Executive Director at the Regional Housing Network, on how municipalities can work with their regional housing agencies to create local emergency rental assistance programs. Shelley, if it's okay, I'm going to start with you. Welcome to this webinar.
Hi.
Shelley, can you provide us with a sense of how many municipalities have expressed interest in setting up their own local emergency rental assistance funds?
Sure. So we have been very heartened to see just how many communities across the state are concerned about their renters, particularly their low-income renters. There are dozens of communities, cities, and towns across Massachusetts, from the Cape and Islands all the way out to the Berkshires, that are setting up programs. Some have already distributed funds. Many are taking applications, and still dozens others are considering and working towards that, trying to put together the funds and establishing programs. So it's all different sizes of communities and all across the state. And we have put out a survey between DHCD, MHP, and CHAPA have distributed a survey asking communities to respond with the program that they're setting up and the parameters that they're creating, how many local resources they're also allocating for rent assistance. And those surveys are coming in. We've had, I don't know the number offhand, but it's dozens of communities that have responded. And we'll be aggregating that information and having that more public in hopefully the next week or two.
Great. What resources can cities or towns use for this purpose?
So we're seeing communities use their CPA, Community Preservation Act funds, and their affordable housing trusts are allocating funds. Some of those could also be CPA funds, but housing trusts oftentimes have a variety of resources. We have communities that have allocated general fund dollars for rent assistance, and CDBG, Community Development Block Grant resources have been allocated, as well as donations. So Raphael, you brought up the One Chelsea Fund, and other communities have received donations that they're also allocating for emergency rental assistance.
Shelley, can you tell us a little bit about the differences between these local resources and the RAFT program in terms of how they work, and sort of anything else we should know?
Mm-hmm. So the local programs that are being developed are a lot of the parameters. It's all across the board. You'll see a variety of creativity in how communities are establishing their programs. We have tried to encourage communities that in the best that they can during this time of uncertainty to try to consider the remaining gaps in their community. So Raft serves a certain population and provides a certain amount of resources. We've tried to encourage communities to consider their local need. That's of course difficult because things are changing so rapidly. So in some communities, they're trying to use their local program to complement what Raft is able to provide. In other communities, they are looking at the need that existed before the crisis. And in many of our communities, there were a high percentage of households that were already struggling with their housing costs. There are certain populations in communities that are particularly struggling. So some communities are gearing their resources to very low income, so supplementing Raft because they have so many households that were already struggling, and now we know they're struggling either more, or there are more households that are struggling. In some communities, they know that their households with children are particularly vulnerable right now, and so they may be, in some communities, there may be some preference given to households with children, knowing that once children are unstable, that also creates a host of other concerns in the community and pressures. And then some communities may allow a little bit more resources per household than perhaps what Raft can do. Or if a household received Raft last year or last fall, they may not be eligible for Raft, but still have a need this year. And so the local resources can further supplement vulnerable households. We also see communities working with the regional housing agencies. So some are actually choosing to have the regional housing agency be the administrator of their funds because they already have the infrastructure and the support. So I see them as really complementary, actually.
That's great. I know that the city of Chelsea has set up an excellent, very thoughtful program very quickly and is in the middle of implementing it. I was wondering if you can share some examples of best practices with us, municipalities that have taken sort of the first step and are doing it in a way that we can emulate?
Mm-hmm. So one of the biggest best practice is that while we do have some communities that have the capacity to administer a program in-house, most of our municipalities do not have that capacity. So a really important best practice is for a municipality, whether it's a town or a city, to consider their local partners, whether it's a local nonprofit, a regional nonprofit, but an entity that has experience in managing housing programs, has experience in intake and in income qualifying, and perhaps even lotteries if a community decides to go through a lottery process. So we've been really pleased to see that the majority of our communities that just don't have the internal capacity have really proactively reached out to other entities in their community to engage capacity and interest in running a local program for them. So that's one. Two is to have really clear guidelines of the program, to outline who is eligible, to have an online and paper application process, to advertise it well so that it's widely known in the community that folks can access these resources. So that may mean distributing through the school district or the Council on Aging, the municipality's website that has information and resources about COVID-19, and then explaining the selection process. So there's some openness about how are people going to receive these resources. And lastly, part of the guidelines of having language translation whenever possible. We have several communities that even in these emergency times are doing the best they can to have translations of their guidelines. Some communities in multiple languages so that we make sure that all of our vulnerable residents are able to access the program. And then the last kind of best practice that I wanted to touch on is that we are seeing some conversation around regional approaches. And we would encourage communities to consider this, to not just go it alone. So Martha's Vineyard and the Lower Cape, so Martha's Vineyard already has a regional program and for the whole island, and the Lower Cape's considering a model that's more regional in nature, and we would encourage communities to consider this as well. So those are just some of the key best practices that we're seeing.
Thank you, Shelley. That's really helpful. I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie now. Stephanie, I was wondering how housing consumer education centers help cities and towns administer their local emergency rental assistance programs. Shelley touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you can go a little deeper.
Absolutely. So, first I want to, just sort of recap what we've heard here is in bits and pieces that running a rental assistance program isn't an easy proposition. It's not a first in, first out type of program. There's limited amount of money, whether it's Raft or a municipal program or a private foundation, and a large supply of people in need. So the housing consumer education centers across the state are trained. They've been doing this for years. They have a lot of experience, and they already do administer a variety of programs aside from Raft. And so they can also, as Shelley mentioned, administer a municipal or foundation rental assistance funds. The reason that it's important is you want to have trained staff. You need to have an application, ideally a single application. We have to be thinking about it also sort of from the consumer perspective of not wanting to fill out, several different applications. So the HCECs have the ability to assess, they know the loopholes, they're able to assess the risk for families and have the mechanics to get the money out the door to figure out what's the right program and sort of put all the puzzle pieces together. It's also really time intensive, as Shelley alluded to, it's really time intensive and costly to scale up and staff a new, basically starting a new program from the ground up. And that just slows the money down from getting out the door to people in need. Whereas the HCEC counselors have years of experience, many of them are HUD certified, and they can add that new source of funds, like a municipal fund, without having to build a massive infrastructure around it. So it's just a matter of aggregating the resources and then picking what's the best program for each client. And so we're all very collaborative here and takes very seriously getting the money out the door, while also making sure that we're protecting those public and donor dollars.
Stephanie, if there's a community that's interested in working with a housing consumer education center, how do you recommend they reach out to set up a local rental assistance program?
Well, they can go to masshousinginfo.org and go from there.
And how can housing consumer education centers work with other nonprofits to meet the needs of their clients?
There's a number of different ways. So they're a tool for both municipalities and for other nonprofits. For if you're another nonprofit, you're probably in the front lines. If you're a community action agency, a food bank. So we're one of the tools in your toolbox. So we encourage folks to establish a relationship for cross-referral. By collaborating, we can set up an internal referral process where one agency is on the front line and is perhaps collecting the paperwork from the client while the HCEC is managing administering the money. And that allows folks to be able to keep track of the clients and determine where there still may be gaps. You know, and I also just want to say in terms of administering the programs, you know, I want to acknowledge how cities and towns have really stepped up and are working with their neighbors. With so many people in need, it's really great to have a variety of sources of funds, but it's also important to not have redundancy. So we need to be thinking about this holistically, thinking about two things. You know, do we have programs that are easy to navigate for households in need? That's really important. And also, how do we ensure that there isn't duplication of public or donor dollars? And for us to achieve that, we need to collaborate. And so, for example, a person could be only eligible for $1,000 under a town program, but could get $4,000 under Raft. So making sure that the client gets the best program for their needs is really critical so that we achieve the goal of making the person or the household whole. Conversely, you also don't want a person that can't get money from two different resources because there's limited funds. If someone gets the same funds twice, that's hurting other families in need because there's less money to go around. So administrators need to make sure that everything fits within the guidelines. They need to know the rules and have relationships with all of the different resources out there. I'll just give a quick example. You know, our members are administering local and private funds. One of our members, Housing Assistance Corporation on the Cape, is administering local funds for 2 towns, as well as for the local community foundation. And the way that they're doing it, they're going to use the restricted money first and save Rafts so they can maximize it for the number of households that can be helped. If those funds were divided and administered separately, the people running those various programs would then have to call around to each other, say, you know, what are you giving to so-and-so, and know the timing and the amount of the funding, which becomes burdensome administratively, but particularly so for the client. They'd have to fill out multiple applications, submit the same documents twice, et cetera. So one of the key benefits of having our members administer your program is that you don't have to pay to ramp up a department. The RAs have staff in place, they're administering foundation money, multiple town funds, Raft, all on the same platform. So, you know, if your community has a built-in operation, you know, for a rental assistance program, you know, that's terrific. You can also speak with our HCECs as you're putting together that program, just to identify where there may be gaps. You may be seeing certainly people who are above that 50%, maybe up to 80% who need help, or up to 100%. You may be seeing more homeowners in need. So these are the types of things that our HCECs are available to answer questions about, and it's important to establish a relationship with them.
Excellent. Eric, I was wondering if there are any questions in the chat box that you can share.
There are just a few questions related to local emergency rental assistance programs. One was on the, I'll frame it as the gaps that can be filled, and talking about both income limits and benefit limits. So how can those benefit limits or income limits work with local rental assistance programs? And then related to just the general Raft program, are there efforts to try to raise the amount of resources that households can access, or to serve higher income levels?
Sure. So I'll take the last question first. Yes, certainly there are advocacy efforts in play going on that Rachel's going to talk a little bit about in a moment. to not only advocate for further funding, but also to expand the income limits and the amount per household that's accessible within a period of a year, along with a few other things. When it comes to filling those gaps, certainly going beyond the 50% area median income is important, but it's also needs to be balanced with not being overly prescriptive. You might have your funding sources, or whether they be entitlement, CDBG, or your affordable housing trust might have income limits that you can't go past 80% or 100%. But if you have other sources of funds that you can, that might be helpful, because you could have someone who's making 100% area median income and their income hasn't gone down, but their expenses have gone up significantly. For example, if they have COBRA that they're now paying for because they, one person in their household has lost a job. The other piece that you might see is that, mortgages for middle income housing who can't get deferment or forbearance, those tend to be higher income households, tend to be 2 income families. So really, I think it's important to just touch bases with your regional administering agency, your local HCEC, and find out from them what they're seeing on the ground.
I would just add briefly that we are seeing some communities cap their local emergency assistance programs at 80% of the area median income. Some are capping it at 100% of the area median income because Community Preservation Act funds allow 100% AMI. We also see communities allocating some of their funds specifically to households that are 50% AMI or below to bolster support for the population that Raft primarily serves. So it's all across the board, depending on funding source, as well as some of the need that the community sees locally.
Yeah, the one thing I would just add there is that you don't want to put a minimum. You don't want to put a floor of, it's only 50 to 80%, because you want to have that flexibility built in that if there needs to be more funds going for people under 50%, that they can access it. So right on.
Eric, was there another question?
There was not so much a question, but information that DHCD has asked to share. I'm going to post a link into the chat box that will send you to a emergency rental assistance program survey that DHCD is conducting. And the survey is intended to help state, regional, and local governments and nonprofits better coordinate the local emergency rental assistance programs in Massachusetts. So if you are in a community that is offering this, if you could share it, and if you could fill it out, that will help us coordinate these programs.
Stephanie, I'd like to ask you another question that I think we received prior to this webinar. I think someone was wondering that if someone applies for Raft and is deemed ineligible, what their options are.
That's exactly where having your local Housing Consumer Education Center available to talk to. I encourage everyone to reach out to that HCEC, because they are administering multiple funds. They might be administering a community foundation fund, which is going to have perhaps different eligibility standards. And so they're able to really, they're plugged in, they're on the ground, they have the ability to kind of figure out which pot of money might be accessible. So, particularly if you're working with, as another nonprofit on the ground, taking a look at those initial screening, and they say, oh, I don't think that person would be eligible. When in doubt, pick up the phone, talk to your local HCEC, because they might have other resources that you might not be aware of.
Great. Eric, I wanted to check in with you again to see if you got any new questions that you'd like to ask.
Around area median incomes, if the income maximum is 80% of the area median income for a local emergency rental assistance program, can families at 30% or below of the area median income still apply for the housing assistance set up by the city or town?
Yes, I don't know. Yes, I don't know of any community that says that that gives them a minimum. It's just that they'll set a ceiling. So every program that I know of that has a ceiling of 80% means that any household of any income below that qualifies, can apply.
Thank you, Shelley. A question for Stephanie about how to find the HCEC that serves your community. If you're in a community like Bellingham or Grafton, how would you know which organization you should reach out to that serves your community?
Yeah, so I should clarify that there's a little bit of a nuance here, which is that that not every regional administering agency has a housing consumer education center. So if you were looking just straight for who's the regional administering agency for your city or town, there's a link that was posted in the chat from DHCD's website. And I also believe that we're going to be sending out, if we haven't already, a link from DHCD with all of the different RAAs. If you're looking to connect with your local housing consumer education center, there is another info sheet that went around, and you can also check out masshousinginfo.org. Which will, you can just plug in your city or town and find your HCEC there. One of the things that I just noted from our previous panel, I wanted to just add to the discussion about undocumented families is I know that one of the reasons that that confusion had arisen about that is because the application does ask for a social security number. So one of the things that we have done in working with DHCD is to bring this to their attention, and they've responded quite quickly by saying, okay, we'll just make sure that their instructions are clear that if you don't have a social security number, that you just enter 8888888888. And so if you're working with folks in the immigrant community who do have run into questions around that, that is the information. But again, they can talk to their local administering agency and they can walk them through that process.
Thank you, Stephanie. I just staying on the question of resources for undocumented households. There is a question about how receiving a benefit like Raft may impact the public charge rule for future citizenship applications. Does Raft impact, and this might be a question for Amy or Amanda, does Raft impact the public charge rule?
So we've been told by DHCD's legal counsel that because Raft is state funded, it would not come into play for the public charge rule. I can't speak to any federal programs though.
Thank you. And another question that may be relevant for the immigrant community, is there any way for Raft to pay arrears if one tenant owns a primary tenant money for rent, but there is no direct relationship between the applicant and the owner?
Yes, we have a form that, yeah, it's complicated. They should get in touch with their Raft administering agency. There's probably a way to handle it. We have had people where the applicant is like either subletting or renting from the tenant of record, who then pays the landlord, and we have a form that we try to use in most cases where all three parties sign off that they agree about the situation. But again, we understand, particularly right now, there may be some nuances to that. And so we'd encourage people to get in touch with their Raft administering agency to try to figure out the best creative plan for each unique circumstance.
Thank you. And a question, another question that perhaps either for Amy or for Amanda, how can landlords help people speed up the process, the paperwork process between the tenant and the agency when applying for Raft?
I think just being in contact with your Raft administrator and having that direct link, just so you could send all things together. If there's a good relationship between the tenant and the landlord, instead of each person sending everything separately, if they sent everything right together, they would know that the packet was all coming in at one time, and that they were able to gather that information, as opposed to getting a piece from the landlord and a few days later a piece from the tenant. If they do have that relationship working together, it really will make things work faster.
Thank you. I'm just
I'm-
looking, oh, sorry, Raphael, go ahead.
Well, while you're looking, I wanted to point out to people that there were a lot of useful links and resources provided to you in the chat box. And if now or at the end of the meeting, you click on the 3 dots in the chat box, it will save it, the whole communication string, and you will be able to access those resources afterwards.
Thank you. The next question I want to pose to perhaps to Stephanie, but maybe even to Rachel, who may be able to speak on this. Throughout this webinar, we've encouraged people in need to apply for Raft. Will there be adequate funding available to cover these costs? And what happens, where does that money come from? And what happens if we run out?
So great question, and that's something that certainly keeps us all up at night. But I think that we've seen a tremendous commitment from both the legislature and as well from the Baker administration. So as the Undersecretary mentioned at the beginning, when this emergency first started, there was a transfer of funds that was able to last actually through the beginning of next fiscal year, which starts July 1. And DHCD was actually able to make sure that the traditional downstream raft also carries over. That's probably at this point going to run out before then. But the legislature is in the midst of the appropriations process. We know it's not going to look the same as it has in previous years. There's talk of 1/12 budgets, quarterly budgets. So we're not sure what it's going to look like. But we will absolutely be advocating for additional funds. And I think at this point, it's a good point to hand it over to Rachel.
And before we do that, let me just jump in because I think this is a good time to transition. So I wanted to thank Shelley and Stephanie for being on this second panel. If we were in a room, not in a Zoom, everybody would be clapping for all panelists right now. But I want to hand it over to Rachel Heller, the CEO of CHAPA, to close us out. And maybe as part of your closeout, you can also answer that question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Raphael. And thank you, all the panelists and everybody for joining us today. As Raphael said in the beginning of this call, it's monumental that Massachusetts passed one of the strongest in the country, eviction and foreclosure moratoriums. This provides a pause that will help people to remain safely in their homes during this time. Now, what we do during this pause will determine the long-term stability for people through this crisis and when the crisis ends. And so emergency rental assistance, we know, is critical to individual health outcomes, to our public health, and to the recovery of our economy. So we need to all be working together at the state level to advocate for more resources for Raft. Locally, work in your community to create emergency rental assistance programs and to advocate for more affordable housing production, because we know that is the ultimate solution for people to have stable homes. And we need to work federally to increase resources for rental assistance. So today, I would ask that you call your state legislator, email your state legislator, and ask for their support to add $50 million to Raft and to have it serve more people by expanding the eligibility up to 80% of the area median income during this emergency. And as has been stated, we want to increase the amount that people can access. We know that this is a really uncertain time. People's incomes are really fluctuating. And so it's important that right now that we increase the amount available for people from $4,000 up to $10,000 per household. CHAPA has also been advocating for federal resources coming to Massachusetts, like CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant, to be used for rental assistance. And we've been advocating that any relief package from Congress include rental assistance. This made it into the House HEROES Act that you might have heard about that passed on Friday. Unfortunately, we need the Senate to pass it, and that looks like a challenge for the next couple of months. But call your member of Congress today, tell them what you are seeing, what you're experiencing, what's happening in your community, and make sure that rental assistance is a priority. I also ask that if you're interested in staying on top of this, advocating for these policies, get involved, please. CHAPA has policy committees that are working on the budget. We have committees that are focused on housing stability. rental assistance, and the production and preservation of affordable housing. Eric is going to put a link to our website on the chat so that you can sign up for a committee and you can stay on top of this, know what's happening, and help really inform what kind of policies that we're advocating for. So today's webinar, this forum will be is being recorded, as you know. It will be posted so that you can access it later. And we will be developing frequently asked questions out of this, so we can try to get everything, a lot in writing of what we're responding to today, as well as some of the questions that we may not have gotten to. But I just want to thank everybody again for joining us. CHAPA and the Regional Housing Network are really looking forward to working with everybody to increase the resources available for emergency rental assistance and long-term rental assistance so that people are stable through this crisis and long afterwards. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and I hope that you are well. Thank you. And with that, we conclude.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Raphael. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Stephanie. We will follow up by email with everybody who's registered for this meeting. We'll be able to send out a link to the recording as well as all the materials and the frequently asked questions that we'll put together to cover those questions that we weren't able to get to today. I wanted to thank you for your engagement and for your advocacy on this and for all of the questions that you did submit. I hope everyone stays healthy.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
You too.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you.